You're about to listen to today's episode of the Yet Another Value podcast. Today's episode is with Byrne Hobart from the Diff. We're doing our monthly Fintwit book club. We're talking about Clashing Over Commerce, a history of U.S. trade policy. I hope you like it and enjoy. This podcast is brought to you by AlphaSense. Those of you who've been following the podcast and the blog know that I've been doing a lot of work recently on shareholder engagement, particularly at these busted biotechs. I've done recently a podcast on Sage and KROS. You guys can go and look in the show notes. I've posted a lot on the blog about busted biotechs, why this time is different, all of these companies that are trading at enormous discounts to cash. So given my focus on corporate governance and shareholder engagement, I worked with AlphaSense and they said, hey, let's do a free webinar. We'll get you in touch with the corporate governance experts. Let's do a free webinar and kind of bring some information and get you a little smart on it. So we did the free webinar. It was really excellent. It was with a professor at the University of Chicago who actually teaches corporate governance, has been on 100 boards, including almost 20 public company boards. We had very differing views, but it was really interesting to get his insights as someone who's been there, his insights and kind of his differentiation from how I'm viewing corporate governance. So you can go check out that webinar. I'll include a link in the show notes, or you can just go to alpha-sense.com/YAVP to get a free trial and kind of show them thank you for the support of this podcast. All right. Hello and welcome to the Yet Another Value Fintwit Book Club podcast. With me today, I'm happy to have on my co-host for the podcast from one of my favorite newsletters, The Diff, Byrne Hobart. Byrne, how's it going?
Great.
Cool. Well, look, before we get started, disclaimer, remind everyone, nothing on this podcast is investing advice. There'll be a full disclaimer at the end and in the show notes so you can see it there. Byrne, the book we're going to talk about, look, we are recording, it is April 28th. For those of you who are listening to the podcast 3 months, 3 years in the future, or have been under a rock, this month has been all about tariffs in the entire world. We had Liberation Day, was it April 6th or whatever, markets down, markets up. It's all about tariffs. So you chose Clashing Over Commerce, a history of U.S. trade policy. I mean, it is deep. It is 1,200 pages. I budgeted a lot of time to read it, and I did not. I'm still kind of just at the end of the Cold War, but I had so many questions. So let me start here. This is a full-fledged history of the tariffs. We can talk everything here. But when you read this book, The History of Tariffs here, do they make you feel better, worse, or kind of neutral about the state of the world that we're in as we talk on April 28th?
Yeah, so I actually ended up feeling a lot better. I think when I read it the first time, tariffs were just kind of a non-issue. It was sort of this history of, okay, we used to have them and now we don't, and kind of here's how that came about. And then, so when I would read it, I was kind of more attuned to, okay, well, that sounds like an inconvenient thing I'm glad I don't have to deal with, et cetera. And then reading it now from the perspective of, there will be almost certainly higher, but who knows how much higher tariffs on many different trade partners. I was kind of coming into it expecting that I'd read all these really grim stories about, how this is totally wealth destructive and, completely messed with U.S. industrial development. And the book is actually just surprisingly neutral on tariffs. Like, it does mention that they have this deadweight loss, but it also mentions that just in terms of the scope of things, they were not that big a deal. But I think that a lot of that has to be tempered with just observations about how modern supply chains differ from historical ones, where the other big contribution to free trade in the time period in which tariffs went to roughly zero was containerization, which was also, it was effectively a cut in tariffs, where it cut in the implicit tariff of it's expensive to load things onto and off of ships. If you can make that really cheap, then you can move more stuff around. And if you can move more stuff around in general, one of the things you can do is do high value added manufacturing in one place and then ship things for final assembly somewhere else. So it does mean that the economy is just more interconnected, and there are fewer cases where you buy a product where everything is homegrown and that's the best place for it to be. Like I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, and I was thinking about a loaf of bread. And if you buy a loaf of bread from a grocery store, you have this mix of different ingredients, and the one that is the most susceptible to free trade is probably either the plastic bag it's in or the twist tie.
That's what I'm.
And the twist tie supply chain is going to include the extraction of whatever the hydrocarbon feedstock is, and then the manufacturing of the bulk plastic, and then the extrusion of the little twist tie thing, and then you've got the metal, and there has to be a supply chain for actually mining that, and then refining it, forging it into something specific. And so what occurred to me is that the really expensive part of the bread is actually the part that we just get from the United States, that we grow wheat and bake it into bread. So it's American land, American labor. That's the expensive part. And then the incredibly cheap part is the set of this that can pretty much circumnavigate the globe in terms of all of its inputs. And yet it's really, really cheap because it's all of those things are getting built, and wherever in the world they're the cheapest to make because you can ship them pretty much anywhere. So I think in some ways, like part of the way I reacted to the book was like I sort of felt like I did not get out of it what I was hoping to. Because what I was hoping to get out of it is just, okay, here's some context, and now I better understand Donald Trump. And then literally from the opening chapter, it sets up this model of US politics where you have these different constituencies. You have people who were mostly agrarian, mostly Southern, who really wanted just more trade. So they want low tariff barriers. Then you have Northern, more manufacturing oriented economies where they're competing directly with US trade partners. So they want barriers to trade. But then you have also in the North, shipbuilding and just general trading businesses, and they want free trade. And then like none of that actually applies to the current debate. It's really not the case that like someone in greater Boston really opposes this because it's going to hurt their job, really likes this because they'll keep their job at the textile mill. Like we're a couple generations off from that kind of political economy.
Let me pause you there. So I was walking with my wife last night, and I said the same thing. You started this out. And by the way, you hit on all the points I want to touch throughout this book, but I said the same thing you started out to my wife. I was like, look, I'm reading this book on tariffs. It's a behemoth, but I'm like 700 pages in. And I will tell you, when I read it, I alternate between feeling much better. Like if I had read this on April 9th, when markets were really dropping, I would have been like, oh, we've been here before. I think I feel better. I don't know. But I would alternate page by page between feeling much better. You see so many parallels. This has happened so many times in history versus feeling much worse, where I'd be like, look, after the Great Depression and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were kind of a settled issue. And like, yes, we've had big tariffs and big stuff before, but it's never great when you're saying, hey, we haven't really been fighting over tariffs in 100 years. And the last time we had a really big fight over them, it was like not only leading to the Great Depression, like people argue, did this cause the Great Depression or not? So I kind of alternating between feeling better because it's happened and worse because, yes, it's happened, but it hasn't happened in 100 years. And by the way, the economy, they're talking about export imports. I think in the Revolutionary War, they're like, the imports went up from $3.6 million this year to $600,000 this year, right? Like right. That was like sending stuff on ships over weeks and stuff. There wasn't a lot versus today where it's just in time shipping, it really integrated. So I don't know. I didn't know if I felt better or worse. So I'd love for you to talk about, you said what made you feel better. I kind of laid out some of the things that made you feel worse. Tell me some of the stuff that made you feel worse as you were reading this book.
Yeah, so part of what made me feel like the book, it was also something where I'd kind of remembered it as more of this economic history of tariffs, but a lot of it is actually a political history of how do we choose which tariffs to get. And then, secondarily, we consider the economic impact that people expected, the economic impact that happened. But one of the things that stands out is just once you have tariffs and once they're a live political issue, everything slows down massively because every company, every interest group is embedded in some kind of supply chain. And so like it has that chart somewhere in the book of just how much time and how many pages of testimony were produced for different tariff acts?
If I can jump in, my favorite example of this is the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where they're increasing the tariffs on literally everything. I think it takes 15 months for them to do it because literally every interest group comes in and says, hey, if we're increasing tariffs, you got to protect us from everyone outside of us, right? And then when they're reducing them, when the Roosevelt administration is kind of doing the MFNs, most favored nature, nobody comes in because if you're reducing across the board, then nobody really cares. So as you're saying, once the tariffs get in, the special interest groups do it, and time again, the tariffs, it kind of gets picked apart because people start saying the deep state, this is just so ripe for special interest groups, fraud, lobbying, all this sort of stuff. I didn't realize lobbying comes from something, I believe it was Cleveland, who's hanging out in one of the hotel bars, or maybe it was Grant. Yeah. Grant's
hanging out in the hotel bar, smoking cigars. And so if you can walk by and
but it was related to tariffs. It was the main way they were doing it.
Yeah. So there was that. I think there's something like we have 15 pages of testimony about tomatoes and just the importance of protecting American tomatoes from foreign competition. And I think this was also
over 3 days. It was 15 pages over 3 days, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. So like if you were a free trade person, I think you were probably losing some fights to just pure attrition. Like I don't want the fourth day of discussing how important tomatoes are. So fine, we can raise the tariff on them.
Many lawmakers over the 200 years that I've read so far in the book, they do one tariff reform and they end and they'll say, that was the worst 6 weeks of my life. I will never do this again. Like this is for the next generation to settle it. So you're right. You lose a
Right.
ton to attrition.
And then one of the other interesting things in there was I'd sort of had this stereotype in my head of, okay, it's the Gilded Age, there's widespread political corruption in, late 19th century. And we also had high tariffs. So my assumption was it's all these captains of industry who are, they purchase a senator and then they tell that senator, okay, here are the industries
Yeah.
you're going to protect. And there was a little of that, but it actually seemed like a lot of the book actually calls this out, that a lot of the biggest companies by 1900 or so, they actually were pretty indifferent to tariffs and did not spend very much money on lobbying because they were actually the largest, most efficient scale producers. And so they had an interest in more trade because they could totally dominate the US market and they wanted access to Europe. So Europeans needed dollars to buy their stuff. So they were pretty neutral. It was actually the smaller companies that really cared about tariffs. And if you think about just economically, what is the impact of a tariff? On the margin, it's the company that would not have would not quite have been competitive enough without tariffs, but it is competitive enough with them. So those are often going to be less efficient producers, and maybe they are in industries where it doesn't make as much sense to do it in a high cost labor market. And the book does point out that just from the beginning, like literally from even the colonial era, the US, what is now the US, just had higher wages than the rest of the world. And originally, it was all down to just land. There was more land per capita in the US than in Europe. And so the market clearing price for getting someone to work on that land was quite high.
So I should also note this book actually, my Kindle, I'm holding it up. It's blurred for those of you on YouTube, but this Kindle has been with me, trusty Kindle, for 7 years. It actually encouraged me to get a new Kindle because I was highlighting so much. I found so much interesting here. But let me start with one thing. Again, this is a book on tariffs. And if we had decided to read a book on alcohol regulation, I think we would be shocked by how much alcohol regulation flows through the course of the course of American history. The musical line. When Britain tried to tax our tea, we got frisky. What you think is going to happen when they try to tax our whiskey? There would be lots of fights over alcohol. This book makes it seem like tariffs, especially the first 150 years or so of American history, tariffs were the dominating force of American history. And there was a lot that I had forgotten. Obviously, you think the Tea Party, that's a tariff, but I hadn't kind of thought about that. Taxation without representation, that was tariffs. But there's tons of other stuff. Like, for one, South Carolina nullification crisis in the 1830s. I had thought that was related to slavery. It was actually related to tariffs. My question for you here is it because we're reading a book on tariffs that tariffs are like the through line of the first 150 years? Or do you think it really was tariffs were, maybe to our modern understanding, we don't quite appreciate how important it was in the 1800s? There was no income tax. This was the government's only form of revenue.
Yeah, so the book does talk a little bit about this, where through the late 19th or early, I think it's through the early 20th century, tariffs were the main way that the US government funded itself. And also the government was a lot smaller. And they actually mentioned very early on that it was something, I think the number is something like your cost of collecting an excise tax was about 20 cents on the dollar, and your cost of collecting a tariff was about 2 cents on the dollar.
Yep.
Just there are only so many ports that we can move things through.
Yep.
And so, it's, I guess, at a high enough tariff, smuggling probably still does make sense. But at lower tariffs, and also, I guess if you have a pretty interconnected economy, like the smuggling thing gets tricky because now it's a bad idea to buy insurance and you probably can't borrow. And so you just, it's sort of like when companies try not to use the dollar system, or when they're kicked out of the dollar system and they find out actually it's just really a pain to do any kind of business with anybody now. So yeah, they were a big revenue source, and then unlocking the income tax as a potentially much larger revenue source did make them less important. And so I think you can look at the pre-income tax tariff debates as partly this debate over, okay, how big is the US government supposed to be, and what is the expected scope of its activities? And that did become a contentious regional issue because people in the South recognized that tariffs were going to hurt their ability to export cotton and tobacco. And they also recognized that even though people in the North were talking about tariffs as just this generally good thing, and we need to protect American industry and we also need the revenue, et cetera, that they obviously had a direct economic interest in that too. Which is actually like, I think that is a surprisingly, and I don't know if you saw this too. Like I was surprised at just how sophisticated some of the economic thinking was, given that they just, they didn't have a lot of the economic models that we have today, and these things weren't really in the water the way they are now. But people in the southern U.S. in the late 18th century still understood that if you want to sell more cotton overseas, you actually need people overseas to be selling stuff to you, because otherwise there's just this imbalance that can't be sustained.
I'd go back and forth between being impressed by how sophisticated the analysis was. Like basically, they figured out an export tax is an import tax pretty quickly. If you were, as you said, I'd go back and forth between that and then kind of how unsophisticated I thought some of it was. Right, like you'd see time and time again, we'd enter a recession or a depression, the Great Depression, and people would say, "Hey, now is not the time to bring down these tariff rates. Like the economy is suffering. What are we, if we bring down the tariffs, imagine the pain." And you're kind of like, well, again, we can agree, disagree on tariffs, but if you think that tariffs, bringing down taxes is generally one of the good ways. So, or, the economy would go into recession and tariff rates would drop and they wouldn't want to bring down tariffs because the government would say, oh man, we're really in it now. Like that's all of our revenue. Now we're running a deficit. We need to raise tariffs to get our budget balance. You'd be like, no, that's not Keynesian. Like you need to research the demand.
He makes this really, Duggar makes a really interesting point in the book that if you actually look at tariff levels and U.S. economic growth, that what you actually see is that when there is a low tariff, there's often a financial crisis, and when there's a high tariff, there's often rapid economic growth. But the reason for that is that they were the main source of revenue. So you would tend to see tariffs get cut when the U.S. government is running a surplus, and then tariffs get raised when it runs a deficit. And there's this funny bit, I think it's for the 1880s or 1890s, where the big crisis, the looming crisis, is the surplus is too big, and we just can't spend money fast enough, and we're worried that this is going to, like, we're worried that basically all the circulating currency is just going to be hoarded by the Treasury by accident because they had these high tariffs and the economy was growing very strongly. And they did end up trying to solve that by just offering much more generous Civil War pensions, which also, that is, for just that generation after the Civil War, that is actually one of the big through lines of American politics, is that there Civil War pensions, very easy to argue for, very tied to the Republican Party, of course, and a very good vehicle for graft, because after the pensions are expanded from if you served you get money to if you were injured, and then your kids get money, your widow gets money, your spouse gets money. So yeah, it became a very gameable system. And then, that kind of puts other later political issues into a different context. Like I feel like if I grew up in the Deep South and it's the early 20th century, yeah, I would be very skeptical of just all the things that Yankees say about all of the good things they're going to do for the world, because I would remember that this hugely salient issue was let's tax everybody but disproportionately the South in order to give benefits to our side. And I would recognize that this was originally a very public spirited and good thing to do, but also that they kept doing it well past that point.
I have this every time I read a history book, but I mean, really with this book, they say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. And every time you read a history book, you'll see a little bit like, oh, I see echoes of this leader's here, what I'm hearing from this world leader right now. I mean, my God, again, the reason I had to get a new Kindle because I was highlighting so much. And you could take 1,000 quotes from here and maybe blur out the party, but a lot of times actually not blur out the party, because the Republicans were the party of high tariffs. I could clip it today and we could start a Twitter firestorm with people being like, that's the stupidest thing. Be like, hey, man, this was 100 years ago. It was just crazy how much it rhymed. To go back to, I mean, the Civil War payments very much rhymes with Doge and Social Security right now. Obviously, there were lots of parallels between those. To go back to sophisticated analysis early on. I mean, one of the things I was kind of surprised by was how much the founding fathers thought about tariffs. Again, this was the main way they were going to fund the government. A lot of the revolution was over taxation without representation, which back then was tariffs. But, there's a quote from Madison that Madison correctly anticipates the fundamental issue in trade policy is degree to which domestic producers should be protected from foreign competition. One of the reasons they have to deal away with the original, what did they call the original, the League of the United States or whatever. One of the reasons they had
Oh
to
yeah,
do it.
the Confederate. Yeah,
Yeah, I loved it
the
when
Confederates.
Britain would take the Confederate and it'd be like, hey, New York, why don't you give us a lower tax than Pennsylvania? So they'd play all the
Right.
states off each other. But yeah, I don't know where I want to go there. I was just really surprised by history doesn't rhyme, it repeats, but it was really rhyming from literally the beginning of American history.
Yeah, yeah, like it did seem like like even some of the other factors, like the US is less dependent on trade. It has a lot of internal resources, and like when the book begins, it's the US has a lot of these internal resources that we can exploit on our own without importing stuff. And then at this point, it's more like partly because of that, and partly because of the institutions that were built off of that. We do have this large, very competitive service sector economy where it really does not need any kind of protection from foreign competition, except to the extent that it's mitigating something unfair that other countries are doing. So something like, I don't think the U.S. needs some kind of law that says that you can't start, that if you're a French search engine or French social network, that you have to pay some extra fee to do business with Americans. On the other hand, there seem to be like all these weird contours of European antitrust law and privacy law that mysteriously American companies are really good at tripping, and that they have to pay big fines, and European companies are often somehow very safe from that. So, there are these other forms of protectionism, which I think were just harder to get away with when you didn't really have something like a multinational corporation in the modern sense, or if you did, it was actually it was multinational, but mostly doing business with with countries in Asia or Africa, where it just like Europeans did not really consider them geopolitical peers at all. So the countries were just kind of running, or the companies were just kind of running things more so than doing business and having to comply with local laws.
Let me give you one that kind of, eh, one of the things the book makes clear is, hey, one of the reasons tariff policy is so interesting is because it's a place where people frequently put constituents over party, right? Like if you are elected by your constituents and you're a Republican and a Republican of the 17 or the 1800s, and your constituents all are all agricultural, you're probably going to be for pretty low tariffs because your constituents want to sell, right? They've recognized all the issues, despite the fact that the Republicans traditionally northern base are high tariff policy. The reason I bring this up is I've been pretty surprised in the current climate. One more thing that and this tends to persist over time. Like if you were in the South, you tended to be in favor of low tariffs because you sold a lot of agricultural. And the book notes, I love the note that the correlation between voting on tariffs in 1828 and voting for the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993 was 60%, which is pretty high over
Yeah, over
almost
that kind
200
of
years, right?
timeline. I also like the other, I like you do, but I do like that the book will sometimes interject with, the bill was passed or the bill failed, and every Democrat voted for it except the representatives of Louisiana, because they have a sugar industry and they
Yep.
wanted to keep the sugar out. Like that's always the one where they are not in favor of free trade, because free trade means more competitive sugar from
Oh,
elsewhere.
the other thing I loved is time and time again, they'd be like, it would come down, whether it was a congressional vote or a presidential election, they'd be like, it come down to the swing state of Pennsylvania. And I don't know how Pennsylvania's demographics have enabled it to be a swing state since the founding of our country. It's just crazy that it is, Louisiana has sugarcane, New York has New York City, and I'm sure lots of other things for both of them, but Pennsylvania has swing state. I just don't know how it's been for 250 years.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Uh, anyway, the thing bringing it to today, the thing I've been kind of surprised by is, again, Republicans for 200 years are the party of high tariffs, and obviously Republicans today are not Republicans of the 1860s. But I've been surprised by Republicans still seem to be Republicans today. For the past 20 years, Republicans have been low tax, and that's because a lot of their constituents would benefit from low tax. They've shifted south. As we said, the South tends to favor lower tariffs. Today, you're seeing the Republicans be the high tariff party, and that's switched in 3 years, 2 years, 6 months. I don't know. Are you surprised by how the current cycle seems to be breaking the constituent over party message that you'd kind of get through the past 250 years of this book, if that question makes sense?
I think a lot of it just comes down to Trump and his somewhat idiosyncratic preference for tariffs. And so it's like you can try to reason into why that would be, but I think some of it is just that's something that Trump actually likes. And I guess you could argue, okay, there's the rise of China is more of a threat to U.S. manufacturing and U.S. economic self-sufficiency, and that there's going to be one party that's more of a China hawkish party than the other. And Trump did talk a lot about China in even going back to the 2016 campaign. So it's I think the Republican Party would seem to be more likely than the Democrats to remain or re-become the high tariff party, but it also seems like it is kind of a weird idiosyncratic result of just the current personalities at play.
I have no disagreement with you. And again, we're not pointing out anything unique. It's just you read this book and you would have almost 300 years of history of, hey, the one place where you'll really see representatives break from party, and obviously the parties have been much weaker over time, so much stronger over time. The one place you'll consistently see them break is on tariff policy.
Yeah.
And yes, there are idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump, but it's always interesting when you see something that you've got 300 years of history and the current day for now, you're seeing a divergence from that history. So that's just the only reason I mentioned it. Anything else on that?
Yeah, no, I think other point on it is that tariffs are in part a sort of dignified way for someone who does not have a college education and is in the workforce to basically accept a handout from the government while still having a job that they can actually take pride in. And I think there's a reasonable kind of utilitarian argument that that is actually a reason to have some non-zero level of tariffs. That if you have someone who could work in a factory job and does not find, would prefer the vibe of that over the vibe of working in a restaurant or, at a retailer or in the healthcare space or whatever. If trade barriers make it harder for other countries with cheaper labor to compete with the US, and you are creating these jobs where it's not that the job is fake, like they are doing real work, but the job at that pay scale is an artifact of tariffs keeping the US from importing something from a place where people make $2 an hour or $1 an hour or whatever. That is just a way to do a wealth transfer. There is deadweight loss, but it is a transfer to a constituency that Trump has actually done reasonably well with. So I think that I think that is another piece of it that you can look, like if you are in that constituency, you can look at tariffs as the reason that your job has not moved overseas or the reason your job won't move overseas, and that you know who to thank for that.
I certainly hear you, though. I think the book and economists would argue like there's a line from I think it's Roosevelt, but when they're talking about lowering tariffs and you're starting to see real momentum gain from people who are like, hey, let's lower all these tariffs. Say, hey, yes, we understand that there's 1.2 million jobs that are kind of supported by these tariffs, but that is ignoring the tax on the other 13.2 million people. And as you're saying, like you'd have to measure the deadweight, but I would imagine it's a pretty high deadweight loss to kind of support these 1.2 million people who want to be in a factory versus, be a server and tax the rest of us. But that's kind of an argument for the history day. Let me go to a different one. One of the things I think that's interesting to bring it back to the present, I think it's interesting how the current arguments that we're having are almost a funhouse mirror version of the arguments you have over the past 200 years, right? Like for the past 200 years, it was the tariffs are high, man, it's really scary to try to lower the tariffs. What are we going to do? And today it's, hey, there are low tariffs, let's raise the tariffs. For the past 200 years until kind of the Great Depression, Congress is just the axe in setting the rates, right? And that's one of the reasons they have to go line by line, set the rates. And that's one of the reasons you have a lot of kind of corruption and lobbying in there. Whereas today it's, hey, the president has all the authority and Congress is kind of looking at each other like, oh man, should we take this authority back? It's funny. The 1930s, when they're arguing about it, the Congress is really worried about relegating this power to them. So I'll just turn it over to you. What was your favorite, like, kind of funhouse mirrors aspect of the past versus what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I thought that like that piece was really interesting. There was also this shift around that time from tariffs on mostly particular products to tariffs mostly on specific countries or bilateral deals with specific countries. And it does make sense that Congress would be just really, really good. Like any given congressman is really good at getting benefits for their constituents in the form of protection for whatever the local jobs
My
are.
my boy Pig Iron Kelly. My
Yes,
boy
Pig
Pig
Iron
Iron
Kelly.
Kelly. Yep.
And then this was part of the argument for giving FDR more power to actually sign these bilateral deals was that yeah, the president just he cares more about the overall national party popularity than about the popularity in any one district. And so he's actually more of a disinterested party than any legislator on for either party. And I think this is like the kind of argument where if you're a Democrat at that time and you make that argument, it is perfectly sensible. If you're a Republican, you're listening to that argument and you say, wait a minute, it's very suspicious that yeah, the job we can trust, we can trust whoever has this job to do the right thing for the country and put collective interests over narrow interests. But he is on your side. He's your guy. So, it of course there may be less of a degree of that kind of influence, but it still exists. It's still directionally true that the president is probably going to, I think both Bush and Obama did things that did temporary tariffs that were specifically beneficial to I think one was Pennsylvania and then Michigan. So it still happens even when it's the president, and it especially happens if, as you mentioned, Pennsylvania's in the mix and it's a swing state. But I thought that general evolution made a lot of sense in terms of, funhouse mirror stuff. So one of the things that I guess was kind of a worrisome part of the funhouse mirror effect was that when the U.S. would try to negotiate with Great Britain, part of their backup plan was that they had this low tariff sort of free trade zone of Great Britain and the various colonies,
Yep.
and a lot of that was preserved even after that colonial period. That they still had pretty close trade relationships, and so they didn't need the U.S. all that much. At least they didn't feel the need to do what the U.S. told them to do, whereas the U.S. just didn't quite have that. Implicitly, we did with some of the Latin American countries where we did lower bilateral barriers because we had manufactured goods that they could buy and they weren't making, and they had tropical produce that we also just couldn't grow here. So it didn't really matter. It didn't really matter if American bananas, don't get some kind of privileged treatment because we're not going to grow all that many bananas, but we can certainly consume a lot
It,
of them.
it was another area where you see the parallels to today, where the administration before the big tariffs were rolled out, there's the quote of Lutnick going to be like, look, we're not going to tariff mangoes because we're not exactly growing a lot of mangoes in the United States. And it was just funny when you're reading in the 1870s and they're raising all these tariffs and they're like, well, of course we're going to exempt coffee, for example. And you're like, man, the more things change, the more they see the same. You mentioned British, and there was one particular piece of pre-Revolutionary War trade policy that I wanted to mention. The British, one of the, I can't remember if they explicitly make it or if just the book calculates it, but one of the arguments for the British tariffs is, hey, America, you guys, because you're one of our colonies, you get into the free trade zone, and the British Navy patrols all of the world's all of the globe, and we make it safe for your ships to deliver your cotton, sugarcane, whatever it is. We make it safe for your ships to go. And the book even calculates the value of that protection. And again, more things, history rhymes. I'm just struck by a lot of the arguments today, and this comes back to the dollar and everything, but you'll see the US government, the Trump administration saying, hey, the world is kind of piggybacking off America protecting the oceans, trade routes, whatever it is, and we don't get any payment for that. So I just wanted to throw that out to you. I think it's a really interesting thing. I think it's really interesting 250 years ago. I think it's interesting today. I just want to throw that out at you.
Yeah, like I think one model for that is just that is actually a big U.S. export is this combination of having a pretty coherent system of laws and having a really good financial system and having a widely used currency, and then having a military to back all of that up and ensure that we can actually protect our economic interests and those of America's allies pretty much anywhere. And that you actually, if you do that, you actually get reserve currency status as like the implicit payment that the rest of the world makes to you in exchange for that. And it's not done in a really bilateral way, except through this accidental historical evolution, which is that Iran and North Korea do not really benefit from that. Like, I guess Iran gets the slight positive externality that there are fewer professional pirates out there attacking oil tankers, because if they attack they attack one that's protected by the US, that's a very dumb decision. And so they get some slight benefit from that, but they're, not really supposed to be part of the dollar system, and nor is North Korea. But yeah, everyone else just because of the general way that things work out, they end up wanting to buy dollar denominated assets and wanting to fund a trade deficit that the US runs. And that trade deficit in part pays for things, that trade deficit and the government's fiscal deficit to create the very safe assets that are dollar denominated that these countries want to buy. That does actually fund the system that makes the US such a trustworthy counterparty, and that makes it a little bit easier or a lot easier actually, to trade overseas. So yeah, like if you model that as an export, then what we get more consumption than we otherwise would be able to afford for a given level of local output, because some of the output is the unmeasured global consumer and producer surplus that is created by the US Navy and by the dollar system.
No, that's great. Let's see, just some other thing. Who Look, you probably more than me read a lot of history. Obviously, there are historical parallels, presidential figures that compared to Trump. I think Andrew Jackson gets thrown around a lot. But if I was limiting you to just rhetoric on tariffs and everything that are in this book, who's the historical figure that most reminds you of Trump? Because I had a surprising one, but I'd love to hear yours.
I think it talks a little bit about Hannah and McKinley, and McKinley seemed kind of similar, different level of like kind of polar opposite in terms of how he campaigned. Like Trump
Yep.
sort of campaigned like William Jennings Bryan, and then he governed like McKinley. So that was the one who seemed the most similar. There is some element of Hamilton in
Oh,
Trump's thinking, which is fun because they obviously have a very different process, maybe slightly similar personal lives. Maybe history would be very different if dueling were still semi-tolerated. But it's that Hamilton did have this vision that the US is going to build a lot of stuff and we're going to have a system that actively encourages that. But he also just had a different kind of system in mind. And at that, when the gap is that long, we're talking about such different things, even if we do see some of the same policies show up. What was yours?
I I am surprised you said Hamilton because my surprise figure was Jefferson. Actually,
Hmm.
I just saw so much of Jefferson. Jefferson is a protectionist in the late 17, early 1800s. He's when he's president, he's talking about tariffs. And I've just got all these quotes. Like one again, this book broke my Kindle. I was trying to quote Jefferson when he's trying to get some tariffs going. He some Republicans who are against them. He calls them pseudo Republicans, which reminds me so much of rhinos. And there's just
Yeah.
page after page of Jefferson. I mean, Hamilton says Hamilton the musical's got Hamilton as the man with Tom Mike. Jefferson could spin a pretty hot mic too, and there's just page after page of him dunking on people and trying to raise the tariffs for the American people and for his beloved Virginia. So I'm surprised by Hamilton. McKinley, obviously, Trump talks about loving McKinley, the tariffs. McKinley, I hadn't realized he comes to power because he's a congressman and he supports the McKinley tariffs in the 1890s and then becomes president. But I was kind of surprised, like he's known for tariffs. He's a president of tariffs. His mentions in the book are actually pretty small. Maybe it's just because
Yeah.
of the period and everything. But I thought I was going to be looking at a 200-page McKinley thing. It's like, nope. McKinley, as a congressman, gets the tariffs implemented. He's president, and then on to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah, there was less material. I think I was kind of, I guess, implicitly thinking that we're going to have about the page count per year is going to be roughly a function of the level of tariffs. So
Yes.
when you've got a 60% average tariff on dutiable imports, then you have a lot of stuff to say. But it turns out all you really have to say is, yeah, they passed a bill that raised the average rate from what it was to this higher rate, and then they did it again, and then they undid it, and so on. Whereas there's actually a lot of material towards the end, which I actually like. The book, it kind of, in some ways, it runs out of steam because we do just get to this arrangement where the tariff is a less important political issue, and it just becomes a more technocratic one. It becomes one where people still have opinions, but a lot of the debate is about these narrow details, and it is about just kind of managing this gradual process of reducing everyone's tariffs and everyone's trade barriers. And that's often it's I think this is one of the reasons that trade deals take so long to negotiate is that it's the deal is done between the governments of two countries, and it's some kind of more executive branch flavored negotiation, but the impact is going to have a lot of regional variation, and that's going to tie into intra-party and party level politics. And so that's sort of you will probably automatically have some kind of game of telephone where someone wants to cut a trade deal between two countries, and then they realize that this particular constituency, this swing state is going to swing the other way potentially if this goes through.
No, look, and to your thoughts on intra party deals and regional voting. One of the things that's interesting here is you think of the United States basically brokering TPP and then rejecting TPT with the Asian countries in kind of the 2010s. Like, oh, that's weird. But then you go through the history here. It's very easy to forget United States post World War I League of Nations, and then the United States doesn't join the League of Nations despite sponsoring that. The United States strikes a trade deal with Canada. I can't remember if
Right.
it's
And
the
then we
1800s.
just
And
exit.
so you're like,
Yeah.
exactly to what you're saying. Like again, so much of the stuff you think, oh, this is unique. A lot of the stuff is so similar here. Let's see what else here. You know who my favorite person in the book is?
Who's that?
Roosevelt's, FDR's. He's the head of the Export Import Agency, and he's got a rising power in the administration. And he's kind of pro-tariff, and he burns all. It's like he's a rising
Yeah.
figure in the administration. And then his first deal is he strikes a deal with Nazi Germany, which again, in the 1930s, Nazi Germany is not like today we know Nazi. It's just Nazi Germany. It's another government. But he strikes a deal with Nazi Germany to sell 800,000 tons, I
Bales
don't
of
know what
cotton.
it is,
Yeah.
of cotton, and
Or
for
tons of it. Yeah.
mainly German marks. And then he's immediately escorted out of power. And I was just like, man, this guy had a rising figure. He was kind of on the other side of tariffs because FDR's lowering tariffs, and he burns all his capital striking a deal to sell cotton with Nazi Germany. Like, oh man, that's a rough beat.
Yeah, yeah, and it sucks to make a mistake like that because that's always the thing that defines you is what was your most important job and how badly did you do? And that I'm sure he felt pretty bad the day after he realized this is kind of the end of his career. And then looking at just how political outcomes evolved after that, it just looks worse and worse that he's always going to be the Nazi trade
He
deal guy.
he would have been great in finance though, because the whole Matt Levine thing. If you lose $1 million, it's bad. If you lose $1 billion, you've got another job because people are like, oh, he risked it, he learned. He would have been great in finance because if that's how you flame out in government, imagine how you would have flamed out in finance with that
Yeah.
type of trade deal. Let's see. I think we've covered a lot of it. Again, I could just list quote after quote. I've got one on my screen. United States has a Gordian knot to undo in the matter of interference with world trade by tariffs, quotas, embargoes, and similar trade restrictions. Is that from today? Nope. Again, that's around the 1932s era, and I could find similar quotes for 1870s, 1820s, everything. Anything else kind of interesting that you wanted to call out from the book or anything?
I mean, one of the things that was just funny to me was there's this bit where it's quoting a Texas legislator and he's just throwing out some numbers and he says, people talk about the tariff being for revenue, but actually, I bet that for every dollar of tax revenue, it generates $5 of private gain. And then 6 pages later, it's Irwin talking about macroeconomic, like econometric analyses of the impact of tariffs. And he says, well, it looks like the main part of the impact was about 0.5% of GDP as tax revenue and about 2.5% of GDP as gains for the producers. So somehow this random legislator just gets the number exactly right, just off the cuff, which is great. And
It,
it just, I wonder how much of that is just you would have this more tangible sense if way more people are actually doing physical work and seeing things get made. They're growing things or they're making things, and then some fraction of them are in the service sector, but still a lot more adjacent to that. Like even if you're in the service sector but your job is you're a clerk at a warehouse or you work for the railroad, like you still just see the tangible evidence of this is what trade looks like, and ships come in with this stuff on them, they come out with this other stuff on them. And so maybe people just had these more accurate intuitions about those kinds of things because it was closer to the lived experience. Whereas, if you look at trade today and, you're looking at something like an iPhone, it's, this black rectangle, and there's a whole lot of complicated stuff in here that was designed in a lot of different places and built in a lot of places and all put together in China. And you just don't have that sense of this object containing things that have collectively circumnavigated the globe many, many times before they got into that iPhone that then got to you. And so I think just the efficiency of the modern economy makes it easy for us to sometimes underappreciate trade and just to have really weak intuitions about how big a deal it is and how complicated it is.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a through line of the book too, right? They mentioned it time and again. It's protecting the things that get made, the factory jobs. Like, hey, uh, I don't know, but it's definitely through line with the iPhone, as you said. An iPhone costs what, like $1,500. So I think people kind of think, oh, because it's so small, they don't think about it. If you had $1,500 of name your commodity, it would take up so much room on a ship. So you're kind of like, oh, clearly that's way more important than the iPhone. It's like, no, the iPhone actually probably more important. They've driven down costs and efficiency so much because it's so big. It's actually probably like carrying more than its weight in terms of value, even though I used weight, even though it's way smaller. Just some other random things I loved I think this is, yeah, they go after the smooth tariffs are passed, and then a few years later, they're rolling them back. They go to some congressmen, and all the Republicans are saying, "Hey, giving FDR the power, the president the power to renegotiate."
Oh yeah, I love that echo. Yeah, that there. I think I underlined some speech. Oh yeah, the here we go. Republicans went so far as to say that this bill giving the president power to negotiate tariffs would create a fascist dictatorship in respect to tariffs, and there would be no shackles upon the use of this extraordinary tyrannical dictatorial power over the life and death of the American economy.
But no, I'm on the exact same page because I love the whole point because it has echoes in today, but then I love it because they'll go to individual senators who voted for this new tariffs and then are going to vote for this, and they're like, hey, what's going on? Or they'll go to some of the senators and be like, hey, you're saying it's unconstitutional to vote for this because they're going to lower tariffs. You voted for this when it raised tariffs. What are you going to do? And there's one congressman from it's Minnesota, Harold Knudsen. He says, look, I'll be honest with you. If I thought the president was going to raise tariffs, I wouldn't be making it. I'd vote for this bill in a second and I wouldn't be making a peep. But he's going to lower it. So by God, it's unconstitutional. And I just love the honesty there. And again, you see parallels to today where 10 years ago, you can find any politician you want saying one thing and they're probably acting it out differently. But I just love the honesty of being like, it's not in my constituents' interest. It's not in what I believe. So voted for it, then voted against it now. Yeah, there's tons of other funhouse mirrors things. But anything else jump out to you?
Not really. I thought it's just it adds a lot of texture to like you mentioned before, a lot of other historical debates where it makes more sense and fills in some more gaps about how how the tariff issue became this national issue and really dominated politics for a while. And then I guess it probably did end up just creating different political coalitions. So you would end up with a low tariff coalition that is also part of the pro-slavery coalition before the Civil War. And then you end up with this connection between high tariffs and being opposed to slavery, and probably ties into just a bunch of other stuff. Like I could imagine that if you were the high tariff party, and you know that this means U.S. industry is protected, maybe this affects your view on immigration, where it does mean more people working in these jobs and mitigate some of the wage pressure. And meanwhile, that increase in population in the earlier parts of the 19th century, that does mean more people who are going to eventually spread out into states that haven't determined whether they're free states or slave states. So maybe you end up with people in those states voting your party's way because your party is the one that let them in the first place. So we probably end up up like, it's like there's all this weird path dependency in economics and in politics and in history generally. And even though tariffs were, a non-issue until a couple of weeks ago in U.S. politics, or mostly a non-issue in U.S. politics, we still sometimes inherit institutions that were very much defined by tariffs when they mattered a lot more.
One thing I liked in the book how you'll see again the correlation for voting for NAFTA and voting for the tariffs in 1830 was 60%. So it was actually quite high when you do it over two. But I do love seeing where, at first, if I remember correctly, the Midwest is kind of partnered with the North on higher tariffs. And then when roads get built, so the Midwest can start kind of shipping their grains out of, they go, hey, we're no longer high tariffs, we're low tariffs now. So I love seeing the evolution. One thing I did want to ask you before we wrap this up, and then I have a comment and then we can wrap it up. You will see, especially around slavery, but even later too, when a party is worried the votes are starting to break against it, they add a bunch of states, right? And you see time and time again in history. And look, this is unrelated to tariffs, but as I was reading this and just reading the history, I was surprised. Obviously, there's the talks of Canada or Greenland, whatever, but I was surprised we haven't seen parties breaking to add more states in, especially the recent past where the temperature has gotten really hot between the two parties versus, the 70s or 80s when, yes, people would like to be in power, but I don't think they were like saying every election was the fate of our democracy, I would say. Have you been surprised we haven't started seeing the parties talk about adding states to kind of pack their votes a little bit?
Yeah, I think you want things like that to happen when the temperature is really hot, but you can't actually make things like that happen unless it simmers down a bit. So like I think it makes a lot of practical sense that NorCal and SoCal could be independent, could be separate states, and maybe we keep the state count constant by having just Dakota. On the
Oh,
other
there's going to
hand,
be some South Dakotans and North Dakotans. Not many of them, but there's going to be some who
yeah,
are mad at you.
no, I mean, yeah, just like as an administrative matter, and in terms of having the Senate be roughly representative of the overall population. On the other hand, if you do something like that, what you're basically saying is, I think there should be probably one or two more Democratic senators and probably one or two fewer Republican senators. And so, of course, you kind of know how the votes will break down. And then you could say, okay, the actual compromise is let's split California, but we'll also split Texas. And then the problem is that Texas, Texas is full of Texas nationalists who actually do like Texas as its identity, as part of their identity. And yeah, so I think it is true that you could hypothetically have some kind of pressure release valve like that. It's a lot easier when your country is expanding its territory and is able to buy adjacent territory, and also when land is a big factor of production. So if you have new territory, people can just go there and actually improve their income just because they're going somewhere that's empty, and so they can have their own farm. It'll be a larger farm than they
Yep.
otherwise would. Whereas it's not like, if we did annex Greenland, it's not like we're all going to be going up there and working the rare earth mines, and that the trading floors will be empty because the hedge funds just can't afford to keep all of their employees when they could be out there mining or whaling or something. So in that sense, it changes just what that feedback, what that pressure release valve looks like.
No, you say, and look, I said this off the cuff. This is me just talking out of turn, but I hear that. I just what you said, you talked about the temperature dialing down a little bit, and I'm just as I was reading this and getting the memory jog, the temperature was really high when they were adding states. So I definitely hear you. It'd be easier if the temperature was coming down and people weren't worried about one senator flipping literally everything, the fate of American healthcare or whatever you want it to be. But I'm surprised. You've got Republican controlled trifecta right now. And if history is any indication, like in the 1880s, I think the Republicans have been like, hey, maybe we add in a couple states for, you've got North Dakota and South Dakota. Why don't we have a West and East Dakota that are going to be reliably Republican as well? And just kind of pad our majorities there, because I've just been surprised by that. Last thing I wanted to say, going back to the book, really, really enjoyed this book. Again, highlighting a ton. The two areas that I thought it could improve, and we'll wrap up after this. A, the conclusion, he doesn't even give any thoughts. As you said, he just kind of lays it out there. Here's the history of the tariffs. And I thought he would have a conclusion. He just says, that's the history of tariffs. They've been important. Donald Trump's coming. We'll see what he does. I did think he was interesting. He wraps it up by saying, hey, the history of tariffs says that their tax policy and tariffs are really slow to change. And the past 60 days kind of show otherwise there. But I'll let you comment on that. And I have one last comment.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a really good outline, and in some ways, I think if I gotten to the end of the book and he'd said, well, here is proof, I think this book just proves that tariffs are always a terrible idea, or if he said, this book proves that tariffs have costs and it's always worth it in the end to preserve these jobs or whatever. I think either of those would have made me want to double check some of the quotes and references. But if he's
Yeah.
just reciting a bunch of facts and they're interesting, and also he's able to say tariffs did have an impact. It's just not as big as you would think. And a lot of that was that trade was not as big in the past as it is now. Um, maybe his point is like you want to really belabor a point like that because it's not one of those ideas where you can come up with a really snappy explanation for why that would be so, and then everyone just instantly gets it. So yeah, I was pretty much fine with that, and I'm sure he has views, and but I'm also I think generally economists who write a lot about trade are almost always going to have a view that free trade is a good idea and that tariffs are rarely or never worth it. And so the fact that he was able to say things like, here's who benefited, here's who didn't, or here's where I think the deadweight loss was just not that big. I think that really adds to the credibility of the overall work.
No, now that you say that, I think I agree with you. I did kind of think, hey, this is an economist and historian writing this. He's going to come out and at the end, he's going to dunk and be like, hey, tariffs are terrible. Forget tariffs. Let's lower income taxes, corporate taxes. All taxes are dead. But he does not say that. He's very balanced. The other thing, which I think you will agree with me, man, he could pay me. I wish he had gotten this book edited a little bit better because he will tell the same story 4 times in a row. Again, the book runs probably 1,100 pages of actual reading and then 100 pages of footnotes. I could have gotten this down to 500 pages in 3 days. I mean, he really tells the same stories and stuff. And I just wish he had edited a little bit better. And I know you get a couple cool anecdotes when you can kind of run long, but several times I would read a page and then I'd read it again and I'd flip back and forth, be like, did I just read the same page 3 times in a row? And it's because he would repeat the same story over and over. So
Mhm.
I really am enjoying it, but man, I wish he had edited it just a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, I think you could definitely tell a story that is like this, but it is okay. Here are 5 big tariff debates. We're going to detail what the situation was leading up to them and then how they went. And it does seem like a lot more of it is just part of it maybe is that the tariff debate was pretty continuous. And in fact, there are a lot of bits in the book where he says, okay, here's when he's
Yeah.
president. And then the next thing that happens is here's the big swing during the midterms because of something tariff related. And so, yeah, you do have this blow by blow thing where, especially when tariffs are being written mostly by the legislature, it's every 2 years there is some turnover in who did what. And the more extreme a thing someone did, the more likely it is that they're out and the policy changes again. So, yeah, you have this weird homeostatic mechanism where the tariff has to bounce around in part because it responds to the economic cycle on a lag, and in part because politicians' careers were partly tied to whether or not the voters perceived them as having done a good job on tariffs.
It's one of the last thing, and then we're having. I do love there are a couple of recurring characters, especially on the high tariff side. Henry Clay pops to mind, Pickard and Kelly pops to mind, a few others. But I love when they're just popping up over and over again in across a 30-year period. And I understand politicians are powerful; they tend to get sticky. But I almost felt like a sports fan. In 2006 I was rooting for LeBron James, and now in 2025 I'm rooting for LeBron James. And when I'd see Henry Clay in the 1830s dealing with Andrew Jackson, and then I'd see him 10 or 15 years later, I'd be like, oh yeah, my guy's still out there kicking it. It's really fun to see that. But that's how politics goes. But especially with tariffs and these figures popping up, I thought that was interesting. Any last thoughts? I think I've said that like 4 times, but again, I really liked
No.
it. And we read 700, 800,000 pages. Might as well have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think it was fun. I think it was this look at just a very different political structure than the one we have today in terms of how laws get made and in terms of what the pressures are on them. And it's a lot more literal and personal when it's a slightly smaller country and lobbying is literally you hang out in the lobby of the hotel where President
Yep.
Grant is going to be sipping bourbon and smoking cigars, and you hope that you get a chance to have a fake chance meeting where you get to tell him all about the importance of copper mining or of protecting sugar farmers or whatever it is. So, yeah, I think that, we're always operating in systems that descend from a system that worked in a much more personal and literal way, and just seeing what that system was like and kind of tracing its ancestry to today was just really fun.
But the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean,
Yep.
that chance meeting with Grant, you had that happening at Mar-a-Lago now. And,
Yeah, yeah.
the deep state now, every 20 years with the tariffs, they would be like, hey, we think this is really impacted by the deep state. We need to drop all our tariff reform and look into the impact of lobbying. It was just a really interesting thing. Anyway, Byrne Hobart, we're way over an hour at this point. This has been great. Byrne from the Diff, love it. I am 2 podcasts behind on your on the riff. So I was worried I'd ask you a question and be like, oh, I just discussed this last week on the riff. But appreciate you popping on, and I've got some interesting books for next month. We'll chat next month.
All right. Fun. Always a pleasure.
This podcast is brought to you by AlphaSense. Those of you who've been following the podcast and the blog know that I've been doing a lot of work recently on shareholder engagement, particularly at these busted biotechs. I've done recently a podcast on Sage and KROS. You guys can go and look in the show notes. I've posted a lot on the blog about busted biotechs, why this time is different, all of these companies that are trading at enormous discounts to cash. So given my focus on corporate governance and shareholder engagement, I worked with AlphaSense and they said, hey, let's do a free webinar. We'll get you in touch with the corporate governance experts. Let's do a free webinar and kind of bring some information and get you a little smart on it. So we did the free webinar. It was really excellent. It was with a professor at the University of Chicago who actually teaches corporate governance, has been on 100 boards, including almost 20 public company boards. We had very differing views, but it was really interesting to get his insights as someone who's been there, his insights and kind of his differentiation from how I'm viewing corporate governance. So you can go check out that webinar. I'll include a link in the show notes, or you can just go to alpha-sense.com/YAVP to get a free trial and kind of show them thank you for the support of this podcast. A quick disclaimer, nothing on this podcast should be considered investment advice. Guests or the hosts may have positions in any of the stocks mentioned during this podcast. Please do your own work and consult a financial advisor. Thanks.